It's great to see you too. Thanks so much for having me on.
Oh, it's our pleasure. Now, let's just start with John. John, President Trump has this week pledged to intensify the US campaign to strangle the Iranian economy. These are Trump's words. The most crushing economic operation ever taken against any country on any nation or entity that does business with the regime. So the question here, John, is will economic D-Day work?
No, I don't think it's going to work. I think the first point you want to keep in mind is that the United States and Israel clearly present an existential threat to Iran. So to get Iran to surrender, you are going to have to inflict unbelievable amounts of pain on them. Because again, they're fighting for their life here. And the inclination when you face an existential threat is to fight to the death. So the bar here is very high. That's the first point. The second point is we've had two blockades on Iran so far. One that ran from April 13th to June 17th, then that ended. And then we started another one on July 14th, which continues up to the present. And the blockade didn't work. And because we have no other military option, President Trump has decided to up the ante on the economic side. So what he's doing here, and we want to be very clear, is he's going beyond the blockade. And he's basically saying that what I'm going to do is I'm going to isolate the Iranian economy almost completely by cutting off economic intercourse with countries like China, Russia, Pakistan, and the UAE. That's the name of the game here, to isolate the economy of Iran. And that, coupled with the blockade, will cause Iran to surrender. So the question you have to ask yourself is whether or not you think that the administration can successfully cut Iran off from Chinese trade or Chinese economic intercourse, the same with Russia. And let's look at the UAE as well. The Chinese have already said, and by the way, China is Iran's biggest trading partner, they're not going to play ball, period. The Russians are not going to play ball either. And the fact is that we are a mortal threat, not only to Iran, but we are a mortal threat to China and Russia. And China and Russia have a vested interest in seeing Iran win this war. So we're going to fail with those two very powerful trading partners of Iran. And then there's the UAE. There's no question that if the UAE cuts off all economic relations with Iran, it will hurt, no question. But the fact is the Iranians have a card to play, and they've already played it. They've told the UAE that if you do what the United States says you should do, and you've said you're going to do, the UAE has said they would go along with the United States, but they haven't done so yet. If you do that, we will wreck the UAE. We have the capability to wreck the UAE. We have missiles that could destroy your ports, destroy your refineries, and put you back in the Stone Age. And we will do that. We want you to understand, this is the Iranians talking to the UAE. If you think you're going to bring us to our knees and you're going to get away with it scot-free, you're mistaken, because we're going to bring you to your knees as well. And I would be very surprised if the UAE plays ball with the Americans here and really does cut off all economic intercourse with Iran. But if it does, the Iranians will retaliate, and I wouldn't be surprised if that didn't escalate. And all of this has to be married to the fact that the US economy is in trouble, and we have got to solve this problem quickly, not only for economic reasons, but for political reasons. But the fact is, economic strangulation never happens quickly. It takes time. And again, to go back to where I originally started, Iran is facing an existential threat. So it's going to take a lot of time, if it ever works, to bring the Iranians to their knees. But the fact is, it's not going to work for the reasons I just laid out.
Okay, you mentioned Russia and China and the UAE, but what about Iraq, Turkey, Pakistan? I mean, don't these Iranian trading partners, aren't they also, aren't they vulnerable to Trump's threats?
Let's just take Turkey. If you're Turkey, you know that there's this country out there called Israel, and Israel has its gun sights on you. And the last thing you want to do at this point in time is see Iran go under, because you understand that as soon as Iran goes under, the Israelis will turn their gun sights on you, Turkey. And we all know that the Israelis and the Americans are joined at the hip. We know that these are two genocidal states. If you're Turkey, the last thing you want to do is see Iran go under. So you will either overtly or surreptitiously help the Iranians. The fact is that most people around the world and most countries around the world are rooting for the Iranians. We like to think, we here in the United States, that we're the good guys and the Iranians are the bad guys. The fact is, I believe that most people on the planet think the opposite. They think that the United States and the Israelis are the bad guys. And most people, I believe, are rooting for the Iranians.
Let's bring in Rose in here. Rose, the Iranian people are already contending with sky-high inflation, very high unemployment. They're struggling to afford basic goods. I mean, the currency has taken a real hit, particularly in the last few weeks. And Trump is betting that putting Iran in a tighter economic stranglehold, that will succeed where the military campaign failed. Plausible?
No, not at all. For all the reasons that John laid out, and for the many historical examples we have where economic strangulation either didn't work or took years and only happened in combination with a massive ground war that also depleted the forces and the strength of the combatants, and ultimately the ones that gave up. So I'm thinking of World War I Germany, for instance. But no, Iran is an extremely nationalistic state. The population, many of them don't like the regime. Probably most of them don't like the regime. But they understand that you go to war with the regime you have, not the regime you wish you had, right? And so they don't like the regime, but the regime is the one thing standing between them and the United States, and they're going to support their government, right? They also are outgunned and outmanned in terms of being able to rise up against the government. It practically never happens, right? Like the sort of implicit theory of economic strangulation is usually something like you make the people suffer, they suffer enough that they finally overthrow the government, and then you magically get a new government in power that gives in to what the attacker is doing or what the coercer is trying to do. That almost never happens, right? But the Iranian government has been extremely good at repressing its population. So even if they did try to rise up against it, it would be very difficult to do so. But the Iranian people know, they understand that they're not just fighting the United States, they're fighting Israel. And part of the plan all along that Trump himself has admitted to was to smash Iran as a functioning state, not just to undo the regime, not just to bring some magically pro-American regime into power, which doesn't exist, right? But this idea that you would get the Kurds, you would arm the Kurds and get them to rise up against the government, that you would pull Iran apart in a way similar to Syria. Iranians, Iran is a multi-ethnic state, and Iranians in Iran are very afraid of the centrifugal forces that could pull apart the country if the government is weakened. So all of these things mitigate against the population rising up against the government. Most likely they will endure the economic hardships and pay the price for it. And there will be no change from the Iranian government in terms of their policy as a result of this.
Okay, but what about Rose Trump's economic D-Day threats towards trading partners of Iran? I mean, could China be badly hurt if the war disrupts its trade with Iran or its access to Iranian oil?
It could be. But again, there's sort of two factors. One, China's actually weathered this crisis way better than most people thought it would, in part because it has humongous oil stockpiles that it is almost certainly drawing down from surreptitiously, that we can't observe it very well, but they're almost certainly doing it. They've cut their imports, but they're not suffering economically by any indicator that we can see. So they've been able to weather it. They also have massive investments in EVs They've been de-risking from petroleum for decades, not because they were worried about Hormuz, but because they were worried about US naval power closing the Strait of Malacca. And so they've been able to weather this disruption really well of their oil. But even sort of aside from that, uh, you know, China can retaliate against the United States in major ways, right? They're a major trading partner of us, and they're a major trading partner of the rest of the world. And they have the ability to strike back in ways that can make it uncomfortable or painful for the United States. And so this administration is remarkably unstrategic in terms of thinking about, if we do action A, everyone else will react with actions B, C, D, and E that will end up hurting the US more than it's
Yes.
worth it to us to take action A.
So just to clarify your point then, Rose, that Trump then won't be willing to risk instigating an economic war with China right now. Beijing has some degree of leverage here. It has enough oil to withstand the loss of Iranian crude. I mean, I suppose you could also make the point that China could also squeeze US critical mineral supplies. John, your thoughts?
I agree completely with Rose. We have $500 billion in trade annually with China. We're going to punish the Chinese because they continue to have economic dealings with Iran. I don't think we're going to do that. You remember after Trump came into office in January 2025, he levied all those tariffs on the Chinese, and the Chinese quickly reminded him how much leverage they have over our economy. Trump backed off. He played nice with the Chinese, and he's continued to play nice with the Chinese. The idea that we have coercive leverage over China or even over Russia is a laughable argument. The UAE is an interesting discussion, but China and Russia, that's not an interesting discussion. This is the problem that the United States faces. It's alienated so many countries around the world. It presents a threat to so many countries around the world that it's hard to get them to cooperate, to put pressure on Iran to work out some sort of deal. Just think about the JCPOA, which Obama crafted and got signed in 2015. He was able to do that because he had a huge amount of support from the Europeans and from the Russians and from the Chinese. Everybody was interested in working with the United States to shut down Iran's nuclear program. Now you have a completely different incentive structure on the part of the Russians and the Chinese, just to name two countries. The Russians, the Chinese, the North Koreans, and the Iranians have all come together in a loose balancing coalition against the United States, which they all view as a mortal enemy. You saw recently where President Trump tried to play kissy face with the North Koreans, and Kim Jong-un wanted nothing to do with it. And the next day fired a couple missiles into the Sea of Japan just to remind President Trump that he's playing hardball and he's not interested in being co-opted by President Trump. So the idea that we have all these friends in the world that we can work with to put pressure on Iran is exactly the opposite of what the case is.
Do you think, by the way, John, that China might feel emboldened as the US withdraws military assets in the Western Pacific? I mean, they were largely meant to project power in Asia. I think of this USS George Washington, the aircraft carrier that's been shipped to the Persian Gulf to make way for the to replace the USS Abraham Lincoln.
Well, I've never thought that the USS George Washington or any aircraft carrier mattered that much in East Asia for purposes of containing China. Those ships
Right.
would be sunk to the bottom of the Jolly Roger very quickly if they tried to get involved in combat against China. But there are a lot of other things going on. We've pulled THAADs and Patriots out of Japan
South
and
Korea.
South Korea. We were supposed to sell Tomahawk missiles to the Japanese, and we told them we can't give them those Tomahawk missiles or sell them those Tomahawk missiles anytime soon. And we have not done that much to improve our containment policy or containment capabilities in East Asia. So I think the Chinese would be in a better position today than they were a year ago if they were interested in taking military action against the United States and its East Asian allies. But I don't see any evidence that the Chinese feel that the balance of power has shifted enough that now is the time to, invade Taiwan or get tougher in the South China Sea. But we do have to be very careful here, because there's no question that we've weakened our capabilities in East Asia.
Okay, back to the economic warfare angle, Rose. Just getting your thoughts on the UAE. It is Iran's most important regional trading partner, yet it has preempted the American move here by moving to restrict transactions with Tehran. Do you agree with John? Or could this be a serious blow to Iran?
I tend to think it's even probably less a serious blow than John suggests. Cutting off trade from the UAE, yes, it would hurt, but Iran is a very, they're a very self-sufficient economy by necessity and have been for decades because of various U.S. sanctions regimes that have been put on them. And I just don't tend to think that trade cessation by the UAE is going to matter all that much, especially because, there's not a land corridor. It's not the same thing as, say, Pakistan or Iraq, right? I tend to think that Pakistan matters a lot more because there's so much possibility of moving goods across borders between those countries. And actually, there's a very thriving oil trade between Iran and Pakistan, an illicit black market smuggling relationship that authorities on both sides have tried to clamp down on for years and have been unable to. So there's just this really porous border that's extremely long that can be a release valve for Iranian oil and many other things. So I tend to think the UAE matters less, probably. But I think ultimately this is all, in some ways, it's splitting hairs, because I don't think trade and economic difficulty is going to be the thing that actually makes the difference in terms of what the government of Iran does.
There's a New York Times report just a couple of days ago, Rose, saying that cutting Iran off from the UAE would deprive Iran not only of a major market, but of a crucial gateway to the world economy. Would you disagree?
I just think that it tends to be overstated. I'm not disagreeing with the reporting, but again, I don't think that the economic benefits of trade with one small, albeit wealthy country is going to be the difference in what Iran does, especially when they have other countries that they can turn to that are much bigger, more powerful, that are more proximate to them, et cetera, et cetera.
John?
Tom, let me ask Rose two questions that are closely related, because she's an expert on this whole question of the flow of oil in and out of the Gulf. I'm wondering, Rose, how many Iranian tankers do you think are getting through the U.S. blockade these days? And furthermore, how do you think about the Iranians' ability to cut off the flow of tankers through the Strait of Hormuz? The administration likes to hint or even say that they're getting lots of tankers and cargo ships through, when all the data seems to indicate the opposite. I'm just curious what you think about both of those blockades and how effective they are.
So it's, I don't have my own spy satellite, right? So take it with a grain of salt, right? A lot of what's going on is unobservable by the public. And a lot of it is probably unobservable even by the US government. But I do think all indications are that Iran has a very difficult time getting around the US blockade. The US blockade is extremely effective in preventing oil from leaving Iranian ports. I think that that's just indisputable. But the US blockade has come and gone and come again. And in that interim month or so, where it was lifted, Iran snuck out, or they didn't even have to sneak out, but they got out large volumes of oil, right? They had it all ready to go. As soon as it was lifted, they sent oil out. And so they have enough oil on water that they don't have an immediate problem in terms of selling oil and getting funding from doing that, right? So they're in a very strong position, I would say, because the blockade was taken down. In terms of Iran's ability to stop oil coming out of Hormuz, the upshot of the war, as I see it, is it's shown that Iran can't completely close the strait and the United States cannot completely open it. And so they're fighting over how much the U.S. can get through and at what cost. We've seen claims from the Treasury Department that the U.S. is getting as much as 10 million barrels a day out, or on good days, 15 or 20. There was some Axios reporting suggesting this. Nobody in the industry takes those numbers seriously. I don't take those numbers seriously. But it does seem like they've been pretty good at getting 3 to 5 million barrels a day through, which is not nothing. It's enough that it extends the timeline before the buffers run out. Can the U.S. scale it up to get even more out? I think it's pretty difficult because of what the operation they're doing is, right? They're doing it at night when it's hard for Iran to see ships. So that closes the window for how many they can get out, right? They have to stagger them because they're trying to avoid, detection by Iran, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's going to keep limits on how much you can just get out in one night, especially because it can take several hours for a tanker to cross Hormuz. This is a tricky, narrow passageway. Their AIS is not on, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a slow, tedious process. I would be very surprised if they could get 10 million barrels or more ever through the Strait. So the question is really, is the U.S. willing to keep doing these shuttle missions that are really risky? So the Apache that was downed several months back, it was engaged in these shuttle operations, according to Reuters reporting. We didn't lose the pilots, thank goodness, but we could have. And then more broadly, we know that the Navy is extremely depleted. We know that there's been strains leading to supply difficulties for the USS Lincoln, for instance, right? We don't know how much of that is attributable to blockade versus the shuttle operations, but it does not seem that the U.S. can keep up these operations indefinitely. But they have managed to extend the timeline before buffers run out. The really tricky thing is it's hard to know, are we seeing slack in the market because the U.S. is actually getting more than 5 million barrels a day out? Or are we seeing slack because China is releasing some unknown number of barrels each day into the market? And there's something there that we can't see, as outside observers, what the composition is of that slack. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
John, I was just going to put this to you. This is the Iranian dissident journalist Mojtaba Hossein, quote, "Nearly all of the Iranian regime's economy is dependent on the UAE network." And the inference from that is that trade cutoffs are potentially more damaging than sanctions because their effects are immediate. So to the extent that's true, wouldn't that hurt Iran?
Well, when you look at the UAE Iran relationship, economic relationship, there is the whole issue of trade, which Rose was focusing on. But there's also just the financial dimension to it. And the Wall Street Journal had an editorial that said 80% of the currencies that flow into Iran go through the UAE. And furthermore, if you look at the financial mechanisms that the Iranians use to work around the economic sanctions that the United States and other countries have on Iran, the Iranians depend heavily on mechanisms inside of the UAE. So the upshot of the Wall Street Journal article was that yes, trade matters here, but it's those financial flows and those financial instruments that are more important. This is one of these cases where I find it hard to judge what the real effect is here, because I just don't know enough. It may be the case that this really matters. But again, the question you have to ask yourself is, what happens if this kind of economic pressure from the UAE begins to work in a serious way on Iran? The question you want to ask yourself is, what do you think Iran is going to do? And you could even generalize and say, what if the United States just begins to push the Iranians to the edge of the cliff? What are they likely to do? And by the way, the same question comes up in the case of Russia-Ukraine. Let's assume that all of our support to Ukraine over time pushes the Russians to the edge of the cliff. Do you think that the Russians are going to throw their hands up and surrender? Do you think the Iranians are going to throw their hands up and surrender? I do not think that for one second. And we have manifest evidence that Iran has a significant military capability here. As well as ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones. It can wreak havoc in the Middle East. It can basically wreck a handful of countries that the international economy depends heavily on. And we already see all sorts of stresses and strains in the international economy. And what happens if the Gulf is in flames as a result of these policies that we're putting on the Iranians? So Rose was saying before that the administration is not very good at strategizing. And I think there's just no question about it. One of the things I learned as a kid, and I think this comes from playing sports, is that you understand that the other side has a retaliatory capability. If you punch somebody in the face in a boxing match, that person doesn't fall to the tarp and that's the end of the fight. That person fights back. You're playing football, whatever. There's an opposing side. It is going to respond to what you do. And when you do strategy of this sort, you want to think about what are the consequences of taking step A. Is the other side going to retaliate in this way? Is it going to retaliate in that way? Is it just going to surrender? And I think if you sort of play these things through, what you see is that we never think about what the other side will do once we smack them up the side of the head. And this gets back to the start of the war on February 28th, right? Rose wrote an op-ed that was based on assessing what the other side would do if we were to go to war against the other side, Iran in this case. But the administration, President Trump in particular here, thought he could just whack the Iranians. We could launch the shock and awe campaign, decapitate the regime. That's the end of it. It's all over with. It hardly ever, if ever, works that way.
Mind you, you did say, though, that one of the, and by the way, and I'm sorry for droning on like the pub ball, we give Rose a lot of credit for her prescience, but you yourself, John, were on this program and elsewhere well before February 28, pointing out that Iran had the capacity to use its ballistic missiles to cause mayhem across the Sunni Gulf allies and also shut down the Strait of Hormuz. But you've said that you think that Trump actually wanted to shut down the 12-day war in June last year because he was pretty sure that Iran was going to shut down the Strait of Hormuz. So he had these instincts before. Why didn't he use that cautious judgment before February 28?
Well, before I answer that question, I just want to make one quick point about me and Rose. There's no question that we were both right. But all I would say is you didn't have to be a genius.
Yeah,
right?
That's fair.
And by the way, many of Trump's advisors, his key advisors, agreed with me and Rose. J.D. Vance, the head of the CIA, Secretary of State Rubio, Vice President.
Probably the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff too, John.
Exactly. So it was Trump and the Israelis who were the anomalies here. But anyway, yeah, I think the whole question of the 12-day war, this is the June 13th to June 25th, 2025 conflict and how it ended is fascinating when you think about us entering the war on February 28th. The reason the war was shut down was for two reasons. One is you said Trump sensed that the Iranians were thinking about shutting down the Strait of Hormuz. And he did not want that to happen. So we put an end to the war. The other thing that was happening that has direct relevance for this war is that the Israelis and the Americans were running out of defensive missiles that could shoot down the incoming Iranian ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones. And we understood that we had limited numbers of these precious munitions, as did the Israelis. So it was the Israelis who wanted to shut the war down.
Yeah.
I argued at the time that the Iranians were foolish to shut the war down.
Mm.
The Iranians should have continued the war, right? This is the last war. Uh,
Yes.
and and anyway, we went to war, and President Trump just ignored what happened in the 12-day war. And those same two sets of factors have been of enormous importance this time. And again, that's no surprise. You don't need to be a genius to understand that.
And Trump has said some rather unconventional things this past week. He posted a map. I'm sure you both saw this. He posted a map with a circle around the Strait of Hormuz, labeling the area, I think something like new US territory. And Rose, what did you make of Trump's threats to bomb Oman? Now, let's be clear here. Oman is a US ally that has been acting as a mediator to end the war against Iran. What's going on there, Rose?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think this is a statement of real policy so much as it's an expression of frustration by Trump without
Mm.
thinking through the consequences. I think it's very unlikely that the US would actually bomb Oman. But I think Trump also doesn't understand how, when you make comments like that, it just shows how erratic you are, how you can't be trusted, right? How no deal is ever final with this guy. And I think that the Iranians learned that. They learned
Yeah,
it, they suspected it for sure after he took the US out of the JCPOA, but they learned it in the 12-day war, and they learned it again in the MOU, in terms of, one day we're signing this thing that basically is giving Iran some authority over the Strait of Hormuz, or, tacitly agreeing to that. The next day we're trying to, smuggle oil through the Oman corridor, which is against what the MOU language said, we would do. We were supposed to consult with Iran, quote unquote. And he doesn't unfreeze the assets, all these other sorts of things. So it undermines his ability to negotiate at all, because no one can take seriously a single thing the man says.
I know.
His own government can't take it seriously.
Yeah. Well, John, I'll put this to you. This is Alan Ayer. I'm sure you're familiar with his work. He's a former US diplomat who played a very important role in the um, Obama nuclear deal negotiations with Iran in 2015. You just mentioned that. Now, he says Oman became a target of Trump's rage this week because he's upset with Oman for the same reason he's upset with South Korea. Neither have solved this problem. John.
Yeah. I mean, Trump is flailing around. He's desperate,
Mhm.
and he should be desperate because he has got himself into a war that, in my opinion, he's